While most people know J.r.r. Tolkien as one of England's greatest authors, and especially one whose works highlighted the beauty of the traditional English lifestyle, what a lot of people don't know is that Tolkien himself was actually born in South Africa. And while his stay in that country was short-lived, it had a tremendous impact on both his life and works, influencing his views on society, race, and much more. Not to mention that it set off a chain of events that made Tolkien the man that we know today. J.r.r. Tolkien was born on January 3, 1892, in the city of Bloemfontein within the Orange Free State, located within what eventually became the South Africa of today. Back then, of course, the Orange Free State was one of the Boer republics, which at the time of Tolkien's birth existed under the suzerainty, the vassalage of sorts, of the British Empire, before eventually being fully absorbed into the new Union of South Africa in 1910. Now, under the arrangement that the British had conducted within the Orange Free State, the Empire would send a number of personnel that worked in a variety of sectors within the region. One of them was an English banker named Arthur Tolkien, who, interested in an opportunity of career advancement in Southern Africa, moved there from the United Kingdom alongside his wife Mabel. Specifically, Arthur served as the Bank of Africa's head of its Bloemfontein office, with the British Bank occupying itself primarily with the mining of precious minerals. The Tolkien family up to that point was and had remained very English, and young John's birth away from England would not influence his identity later in life. While the Tolkiens had originated in the 18th century from East Prussia, by his time the family had been considered English through and through for many years. So English, in fact, that young John, or Ronald as he was known within the family, was inducted to the Church of England following his Anglican baptism in his birthplace of Bloemfontein. This, although the family itself came from a variety of Protestant backgrounds, which included Baptists, Methodists, and Unitarians, while the family itself in South Africa attended a high Anglican service. In 1894, his baby brother Hilary was born, and life for the Tolkien family for a short while continued as normal. Their mother, who rather disliked the climate and environment of Bloemfontein, would take the young boys on holiday to the beautiful seaside of the Cape Colony, which was one of the very few things that Tolkien still remembered for himself from his time in South Africa, with the mesmerizing African landscape capturing his imagination. Some notable incidents that occurred during young Tolkien's time there is of course the famous spider incident, in which the baby was bitten by a large baboon spider in the family's garden. Though Tolkien himself did not recall the event, it is assumed by some that retellings of it must have influenced Tolkien's works on some level, with his famous spider Shelob and Ungoliant being the result. The other famous and considerably more terrifying thing that happened was the time that baby Tolkien was kidnapped for an entire day by a houseboy, who later promptly returned him to his family. In 1894, John and Hilary were brought to England by their mother Mabel as a lengthy family holiday that would give the boys the opportunity to meet their extended family back home. The plan was that Arthur would join the family in England at a later date, as he was unable to leave alongside them due to his work. While the boys and their mother waited in Birmingham for their father and husband, Arthur would never come, having died as a result of rheumatic fever back in Bloemfontein. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Mabel was left alone with 2 children, and no means to make an income of her own in order to support her family. In this situation, she brought the boys to live alongside her parents, until eventually moving out to Worcestershire 2 years later. It was during these formative years that Tolkien discovered and fell in love with the English countryside. As a result of his father's death in Africa, Tolkien was brought up by his mother alone. She tutored him, read to him, and taught him what she knew of botany and plants, as well as the classics and especially Latin. With this, the professor made a strong connection to languages from a very young age, a connection that would define the rest of his life. In letter 71, he would write about his feelings of his birthplace to his son Christopher, who was stationed in South Africa as part of his RAF training in 1944. I was disposed at last to envy you a little, or rather to wish I could be with you, in the hills. There is something in nativity, and though I have few pictorial memories, there is always a curious sense of reminiscence about any stories of Africa, which always move me deeply. Strange that you, my dearest, should have gone back there. During the time following the death of her husband and bringing up her boys on her own, Mabel, who had come from a very devout Baptist family, had undergone a spiritual development that oversaw her conversion to the Roman Catholic faith in 1900. It was from his mother's conversion that j.r.r. was also received too and embraced Catholicism, which was arguably the single most important thing to ever happen to the still young boy. It has been said that Mabel herself was considering Catholicism all the way from her days in South Africa while attending the Anglican service, but regardless, it was 6 years after leaving that she finally made the leap. Her family immediately protested, forsaking their daughter and grandchildren and cutting off any financial aid that they had been providing to the unfortunate family. A few years later, in 1904, Mabel would die as a result of acute diabetes at the age of 34, leaving the boys to her beloved friend and supporter, Father Francis Morgan, and from then on, the rest is history, and not important to the subject of the video. Returning to the topic of South Africa, it was from the family's time there that the seeds of Mabel's conversion of Catholicism first gained ground, and it was after leaving the region permanently due to the death of her husband that she took that final step, changing her son and his future masterpiece forever. Beyond that, Tolkien lived during a time that oversaw the rise of apartheid in South Africa. While the majority of people in Britain after a certain point viewed the practice as abhorrent, Tolkien's unique South African origins gave him not only an extra perspective, but also all the more reason to care in comparison to the average individual. In letter 61, written again to his son Christopher, Tolkien comments that, "As for what you say or hint of local conditions, I knew of them. I don't think they have much changed, even for the worse. I used to hear them discussed by my mother and have ever since taken a special interest in that part of the world. The treatment of color nearly always horrifies anyone going out from Britain, and not only in South Africa. Unfortunately, not many retain that generous sentiment for long." Even more famously, especially because unlike his letters, this was done publicly, Tolkien took the opportunity to state his opposition to South African segregation in his farewell address at the University of Oxford in 1959. There are of course other lands under the Southern Cross. I was born in one, though I do not claim to be the most learned of those who have come hither from the far end of the Dark Continent. But I have the hatred of apartheid in my bones, and most of all, I detest the segregation or separation of language and literature. I do not care which of them you think white. For the rest of his life, Tolkien remained interested in hearing news of what occurred at the place he was born, a place he always viewed with nostalgia and reverence, even though he remembered little, having left at the age of 3, thinking that he would return, though he never did. His mother Mabel, who herself experienced her fair share of discrimination and hardship as an English Catholic convert, and a lone widow no less, made sure to tell her children of how things truly were back in South Africa, things that stayed with them well after her death. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.